Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into today's episode of the Money Insights Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Allen, here with my co-host, Rodney the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, what's up, my friend?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good, but I have a question for you, Rod.
Oh, okay. I'm ready.
Do you need a traditional financial advisor?
Well, the situation is the boss.
The situation is definitely the boss. Well done.
I'm avoiding.
I totally agree.
I'm really going to try to avoid. If I say the D word during this episode, then you just need to call me out. But I'm really going to try to avoid it.
Well done, though. Okay, the situation is the boss. So before we get into our topic today, which, as you have obviously heard, is do I need a traditional financial advisor? Anything new, interesting going on in your world that our listeners need to be aware of? Any of your 47 children been married over the last week or two?
No new marriages.
Any new babies? Any of those like major milestones that seem to happen in your life like every week or two?
Yeah. So our son who recently graduated from college now has an offer.
Oh, okay. So congratulations.
He's going to go. He goes visiting there actually today and nail it down. It's going to be in Wyoming. So that's a little bit different than they were imagining. But energy. He wanted to be in energy, and you go where
the great state of Wyoming. So. Okay. Well, giddy up, Rod.
Yep. Yep.
All right. Well, we are going to be talking about, I think, an interesting topic. Yeah. I mean, especially, and I know it's an interesting topic because it's a topic that we run across pretty frequently. Like, It's not uncommon for people that we work with to kind of be in like I'm not sure, like in a no man's land as it relates to this idea of a financial advisor, because in a lot of ways they're just doing the stuff themselves. Yeah. But in some ways they're like, oh, but I have some investment money, some traditional investment money. Therefore, I need, an advisor to work with me. So and it can be a little bit confusing. The other reason I think this is important is because when you move into the traditional finance, or the move kind of, or I shouldn't even say move from, but if you start to pivot and make like that adjustment where it's not all traditional stuff and we start to move into the alternative space, like there is a mindset shift that also changes. And so I think that comes in, that a lot of that plays into whether I actually need a financial advisor. But either way, there is a lot of consternation. Is that the right word?
That's a great word. Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of consternation around this issue. And so our goal is to hopefully like pull back the curtain a little bit, maybe bring out some like things to light that we don't typically think of as it relates to this question. And then if you're someone who is like, okay, I've been in la la land not knowing whether or not I actually need to use a financial advisor, whether I have one now or whether I'm considering using it. Like the goal for today is to try to like come up with a reasonable direction as to what I should do if I'm that person.
Yeah.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah,
Rod?
I'm excited.
Okay. So that being the case, Rod, I think the starting point is that we need to make sure that we clearly articulate and understand the role of a traditional financial advisor as we're thinking about it. I hesitate to say defining, because this does look very like it can look a little bit different, but I think that there is a prototypical kind of set of things that we see, or set of roles that we expect from a traditional financial advisor. So talk about what some of those are, and then we'll jump into like why someone would use that or not use it and go from there.
Yeah. And I would say it varies a lot based on the person, on what they view as the role or what they're asking the financial advisor to do. But I would say just most clear, like consistently what we see is I'm handing my money to somebody and they're investing it for me. Right. I don't have this expertise. I can't make those decisions for me that are going to get me to the best place in the future. I need someone else to do that for me. And so I'm handing it off, and specifically handing off money so they can invest it in mutual funds, ETFs, I mean, I was going to say
traditional
stocks, bonds.
stuff, right?
I was going to say stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, but in most cases, it's not. It's just mutual funds. It's just, those.
You're right. That's typical. And so I think there's some important elements to understand. Like a financial advisor, well, they can come from various backgrounds, right? You can come from the wirehouse background. Maybe you're a Morgan Stanley Merrill Lynch, which means you're likely heavy onto the traditional investment space, which would give you a better chance of potentially doing stocks, bonds, but still primarily going to be mutual. And then let's talk about why this is, Rod. You made the point that they're not typically recommending like stocks. And the reason is because a prototypical traditional financial advisor meets with as many, like their job is to meet with as many people as they can, potentially bring in assets. But here's the deal. If I'm out there meeting with clients every day, all day, like when do I have a chance to actually make investment decisions inside of somebody's portfolio? The answer is that that's not what a typical traditional financial advisor does. They're usually handing it off to a third party who then is doing the actual money management, right? So their role is more asset gathering and doing some things like, helping you with your asset allocation and maybe the occasional rebalancing or that kind of thing. Like that's more of what they're doing on the investment side, right? Now, hopefully your traditional financial advisor is doing more than just that. Because then if that's the case, I would say you definitely don't need one, right? Hopefully they're at least doing, some other type of planning. They're adding some other value in your world beyond that. So a typical advisor will usually deal with mutual funds and, like basic life insurance needs. They might talk about disability insurance and, retirement planning goals and things like that. Right. That's pretty typical.
Probably if you ask for it, I would say, again, especially with this idea of traditional, and again, it's a broad spectrum of what they offer, where their expertise is coming from. So hopefully they're bringing those things to the table.
Okay, so finish your thought.
Well, and yet I just think there are a lot who are tied into like a platform, like you said, where they sit down with somebody, they do some sort of a risk assessment, and then that dictates where they're going to plug them into that platform. And then someone else, large groups of people out there are doing all the actual maneuvering of money in and out of different funds.
That's a great point. You're right. Most of it has become like automated to the point where the real goal of a traditional financial advisor is not actually to have an expertise, other than an expertise in what we would call gathering assets, which just means sales, right? They're good at getting people to put their money with them. Then they go and they push it to other places, right? So and I think that is like, I mean, again, especially in the wirehouse world, that's how it would be. Now, if we're being totally like transparent and honest, in the life insurance side, the same kind of thing exists because you can come from a wirehouse, you can come from a life insurance background, or there's maybe some third that is all of the other places, but typically you're coming from either an insurance-based financial planning background or an investment. Again, when I say investment, I'm talking specifically about mutual funds, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. But I'm coming from one of those directions. Life insurance side, they're typically going to have more life insurance focus, right? Like that's what the companies that they work with value. Now, the problem with that, the problem with both sides of these is that there's very little actual expertise in those worlds. So like somebody comes into the space, usually they have no experience whatsoever, and their job is to go be a financial advisor. But of course, well, they have no experience, no expertise, like they don't even know how to do it, right? So again, I guess my point here is just to say, like, the typical traditional financial advisor is generally a liaison. And if you get somebody who's really good at it, because here's the thing, generalists can be good, right? But if you get a good one, they could do a variety of things that could bring added value. I guess the problem is that the majority of them are bringing so little beyond what you could read on the internet in 5 or 10 minutes yourself, that it's kind of like, if your plan is, okay, we sat down and let's just say I was trying to think of something that's not a physician, since we always use physicians on the show. Use something else that's not a physician. So, but I'm making $500,000 a year, and I sit down with my brother-in-law, who just recently got a job with Northwestern, as an example, or got a job with Merrill Lynch or whatever, right? I sit down with them and they say like, okay, where are you saving your money? And, you say, oh, I save XYZ with my company's money. And then I have this extra money, and they're like, okay, well, we need to do something with that. So we put that in mutual funds, and then they're like, well, you make good income, so you need some life insurance to cover that. And then that's like the extent of what a plan typically looks like, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. So when I talk about the traditional financial advisor, I am talking about the generalist who doesn't take the time to become a specialist in something.
Yeah. And
I think that's where the value is, specialists.
And I would say like a certified financial planner, a CFP, is someone who goes and gets a lot more education, training, expertise, but it still drives back to what you're saying, right? Because they're meeting with people on a daily basis. That doesn't mean they're now more qualified to go out and pick assets, right? Move your money in and out of different assets. They're going to give you a much better plan than the brother-in-law who just barely got started with Merrill Lynch or Northwestern.
Well,
right?
And they're more likely to, not make mistakes as it relates to telling you what's taxable and what's not. Or there's elements of expertise that they'll gain that will be more solidified, right? But to your point, most CFPs aren't the people who are actually determining the investments. They're still focused on the planning element. And while planning can get complex, particularly as we get, as our kind of wealth accumulates, but even once you get to that stage, like the traditional financial advisor is likely going to pass you off to a specialist anyway. Right. Because they're not going to be the one that handles the estate planning on a, $100 million estate, right? They're probably not going to know what strategies are necessary or that are useful in that situation to help you get the best result. So what do? They find it. So anyway, is there no value? No, there can be value. And hopefully as we kind of walk through this, we'll try to uncover, the situations where it is valuable and where it's not. Now, I wanted to throw this little metaphor out, Rod. A traditional financial advisor is a lot like a family practice physician. Okay. With one very, very important distinction. The human body is infinitely more complex than money.
Okay.
Money is not very complex. There's these set of guidelines that if we learn and understand, we can, pretty easily. It's not like there's 50 elements that could come off of these. It's pretty basics. It's pretty simple, I would say, at least in comparison, right?
Sure.
So while I think about it, I'm like, okay, what's the role of a generalist physician? I could go in there and have a million potential issues, and so there's a lot of directions that they might take me, right? But when I come into a generalist from a money perspective, there's 5 directions to go. And if you learn those handful of directions, then suddenly you have to ask yourself, is the value that I'm getting there? Especially if I'm paying a couple of percent to have somebody manage mutual funds. And we'll talk about why that. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, Rod. So did we at least define sort of what the traditional
again, we could spend another hour on just that conversation because it can be such a broad topic, but I think we've hit it. What's important.
Okay. So next what I want to do is I want to move into the reasons why I would use a traditional financial advisor. Again, if they were, I'm trying to figure out the right way to put this. if I'm looking for the best, so basically what we're saying is, assuming that the advisor did the things that we're about to talk about, these are the reasons that I would potentially want a traditional advisor.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yep.
Whew, okay, Rod, take us through it.
Yeah, well, we talked about the expertise, right? And I would add experience, right? Because again, the brother-in-law that just barely got into it probably isn't the right place to go in this scenario. If we're saying a reason to use a financial advisor is for their expertise and experience, then the guy who doesn't have that now is no longer in that picture, right?
Well, okay, and so let's talk about what could happen. So I've seen situations throughout my career that have cost clients money because of inexperience or lack of expertise. And it was from generalists, right? So when I think about this, like there are situations. So for example, you wouldn't want somebody that didn't have expertise and experience because they might recommend the wrong thing. Like maybe I'm being recommended the wrong product. Maybe I was being recommended long-term care insurance when I actually should have focused on disability insurance first. And that could end up being a cost either in terms of premium or, if heaven forbid, the actual need arose and I wasn't prepared for it, right?
Yeah.
So like there are a lot of reasons, and a generalist should know that these are these core elements are things that we need to plan for, protect, and prepare for. So anyway, I'm kind of going off, but keep going with it, Rod.
Yeah. Well, so when we're going to define, okay, what is the expertise that we would want from the traditional financial advisor, then it does get into things that I couldn't do on my own in a reasonable way, right? And like you said earlier, the access that we have, our ability to understand and apply principles as it relates to investing doesn't take a CFP to do some of those basic things if that's all you're looking for. If all I want to invest in is traditional mutual funds or whatever, then that's an expertise that I don't necessarily need to ask someone else for, right? But if it's the additional planning, like there are just things that I don't know, I recognize that I need help identifying those things, creating an actual plan that then we can move forward with, then I might say, okay, well, I want some expertise and experience on my side to do that. Therefore, I'm going to hire a financial advisor to help me do that.
Okay. So the first couple of reasons that you would hire a traditional advisor is if you were looking for expertise and experience in the planning process specifically.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yep.
Okay. What's the next reason you might hire a traditional advisor?
Well, then if I'm getting beyond some of those just really basic things and I want some personalized direction, or I'm not satisfied with just mutual funds or just, whatever the traditional stuff that's there, and I'm looking for help in additional things like hedge fund options, whatever, like I'm getting beyond just some of the basic stuff, then I need to find someone that can help me with that. I know, again, like we talked about earlier, a traditional financial advisor may or may not be prepared to provide that for me. In most cases, they wouldn't, but hopefully they can direct me to someone. So now getting back to your analogy of the general physician, the family doctor, they're pointing you to specialists who can then help you with some of those things. You can't often get to the specialist without first meeting with the generalist and then getting there.
Rod, I feel you're absolutely right. I feel like I need to reframe this segment a little bit, right? Because we're talking about it as reasons to use financial advisors. And I actually think it's more like, if I were to use a financial advisor, here are the things I would hope to get out of it.
Yeah.
I would hope for the expertise and experience. I would hope, and I say hope and expect, right? Hope and expectation. I would hope for that and expect that my advice was like actually personalized to me, right?
Yes.
And of course, I would hope that they're providing an element of accountability and providing me some peace of mind because they know and are, have my best interest in mind. Like those are the elements that I would hope to get. And I think the broader question is, do we typically get all of those things with a traditional advisor? And I think the answer to that is emphatically no, right?
Mhm.
Most often, I don't get that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It just means that we talk to people all the time, and like that's just not typically what they're getting, right? Again, the typical traditional financial advisor is a asset gatherer, sales first, and again, like we don't have any problem with sales, but like the planning isn't where they have to spend their time. They have to spend their time focused on basically, for lack of a better word, convincing people to do business with them.
Yeah.
And then they pass it off to a specialist.
Yep.
At some future point in time, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew. Rod, I get fired up when I talk about this stuff. So let's move into our next segment and let's talk about why you might not need a traditional financial advisor. And we have quite a few of these. So let's start from the top, Rod. I think this first one is probably the one that people would most immediately think of and move to. And so we're going to hit it first. And that is fees and commissions, high fees and commissions. And really fees and commissions at all is kind of the element. So let's talk about an example. Now, fees and commissions in my mind aren't a bad thing to the extent that they provide value. I always say this when we talk about hedge funds, right? If I have to pay 2 and 20, but I get a killer return, then I don't mind paying 2%. And that's in comparison to a mutual fund portfolio. It'd be crazy to say 2 and 20. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So like the commission, like fees and commissions aren't bad as long as I'm getting enough value from it. So here's part of the issue that I see in this space. On the commission side, it's just so easy to reduce the fees and commission side. It's so easy to reduce that on from like when we're talking about stocks, bonds, mutual funds, that a person would have to provide a unique level of value that I can't get somewhere else for me not to prefer to go to Vanguard and pay next to nothing versus having my brokerage account with my advisor who, like you might ask, like, what are they doing different than what I'm getting from the Vanguard? Like it's a tough one. And yet I could be, if that's $1 million account and I'm paying, 2% on the one that's with my advisor because, my advisor's got to make a fee. And then the people who are actually managing the money on the background have to make a fee. And potentially the mutual fund itself has to make a fee. So suddenly those fees are adding up. And if I'm getting, if I end up with a 7 or 8% return and I take 2.5% out of it, like versus if I could do that at Vanguard and pay, 0.1%, which is, I think, even high. I think it's like 0.0 something percent. So like, it's just an interesting dilemma. And again, from my perspective, I have a really hard time justifying what a traditional advisor is doing if the goal is, returns specifically, because I don't think that they're going to do anything to impact my returns.
And here's what's interesting about that is we use the word platform earlier. The platform that they're using is actually very similar to what Vanguard or some of these others offer, in the sense that when I log into my Vanguard account, it's asking me like questions to get to my basically a risk assessment. Yep. And then it's showing me the kinds of things that fit inside of that, and or with a diversified portfolio of the high cap, low cap.
You can get to that really easily.
And so then the question is, well, to your point, the only way that I can justify paying 2% or more, right, depending on where I am, who I'm using, is if they're able to produce a 2% higher return there than I could get on kind of that, just doing it myself through the Vanguard. And again, well, here's what another really interesting thing. We've seen traditional advisors, we have friends in the business, right? And I watched one go through a system where he analyzed the current investment portfolio of somebody who was looking to, move somewhere else. And what was really interesting to me is that there was so much overlap in the stocks that were owned inside of the variety of different mutual funds that they had. There was so much duplication that it was unnecessary to be in whatever they had, 22 different mutual funds, because in reality, they only were in, again, I don't know the number, but 200 total stocks across all of those mutual funds. And they could have gotten those 200 stocks and had 3 or 4 mutual funds. And even more interesting was when they would point out and say, well, look over here, they're selling this stock out of this mutual fund while your other mutual fund over here is buying that same stock at the same time, but you're paying fees on both sides, on the seller side and on the buyer side. And so that's completely unnecessary. So if that's the world you want to be in, don't pay the extra fees to get there, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's it, right? So the justification, it's a difficult justification. So again, you'd almost have to be doing it because you're saying, hey, I know that they're not likely to bring any additional value on the investment side because I don't know how a traditional advisor does that, right? Like I just don't. Because again, they're not the ones making the investment decisions. And even if they were, you're not going to hire most likely a day trader, right?
Right.
So like that's a totally different world than what we're talking about here. So it just seems really difficult especially when I look at it from an investment perspective. I just have a hard time being in the business. I was securities licensed for a decade. And even then I would look in the mirror and be like, what value am I providing to people other than just saying, hey, this is how we come up with your asset allocation. But again, it wasn't me. It wasn't really my expertise, unless you would call expertise knowing that, we stick your information into this program and it gives me, the asset allocation recommendation. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So anyway, okay. We probably hit that one pretty hard. The next one is potential conflicts of interest. And this obviously exists everywhere inside the financial space. I don't know how you get around it, but from a traditional financial advisor, certainly is going to have potential conflicts of interest, whether it's in the fees, whether it's in the commissions. And so on that one, like, I don't know. It's hard for me to even say it's like a reason not to, because I don't know that anywhere you can go where there's not those conflicts of interest that just inherently exist. And so maybe it's more a question of, okay, does that mean that I, really, what should I do to try to overcome to the best of our ability, those conflicts of interest that do exist? And that's probably an entirely different conversation. But just know that traditional financial advisors certainly have a conflict of interest because they make money based on the people investing with them, people doing business with them. That's not news to anybody.
And just to expand on that a little bit, therefore, anywhere else you're thinking about putting your money, if you go to that financial advisor and you say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, right? Whatever, buy a piece of real estate or get an investment optimizer policy or whatever, and they don't understand that world at all, well, guess what the recommendation is going to be? No, you shouldn't do that. You should put it where I do feel comfortable making recommendations. I know where it is and I make a commission when I do it. You should put it here instead. So you just have to recognize the conflict of interest and where it would lead them to go, and just realize that therefore asking them certain questions is just pointless, right? Or if you do ask the question and you get the predictable answer, okay, well, that was predictable because of that conflict of interest, right?
Yep. Okay, the next point that I think is super important is that traditional financial advisors don't make money when they sell alternative investments. I shouldn't even say that. They don't even attempt to sell alternative. I mean, outside maybe like a REIT or something like that, right? Which is kind of like a real estate mutual fund. So it is a very different vehicle. Doesn't mean that that there's not value in REITs and things like that. But my point is just to suggest that the challenge that you get is if I'm somebody that likes the idea of real estate, like traditional planners and real estate don't go together, right? Typically. And the reason for that is because they're actually incentivized to get you to do things like mutual funds, right?
Yep.
But there is no incentive. In fact, they're disincentivized because not only like, okay, I'll give you an example. If I've got a portfolio of a couple $1 million and you're like, you go to your advisor and you're like, I found this piece of property. And I'm not saying that there's not advisors who will be supportive and understand it and get it, right? But but just understand that they are financially incentivized to get you to stay with them and have that money with them. The second you're doing something different outside of it, suddenly it's, less money for their pockets. Really, no matter how you shake it, right? So I would say, I guess maybe the alternative or the one, and I should throw this out there, the one alternative to this would be like a fee-only planner who's not taking compensation in any other way, which, by the way, is also a little bit unique. Like there are advisors that do exclusively fees for like planning, and they don't take any they won't do business with people. But typically, even your fee advisors will do some sort of combination where they're willing to, and maybe they'll drop the fee if it's a commission product or something like that. So anyway, but that's probably neither here nor there. The main point is to just understand that they're incentivized to go to mutual funds, which is why we get pushed toward mutual funds.
Yeah.
So the final point I just want to emphasize is that if you're somebody that has any interest in the alternative space, everything in the traditional space goes against that, right? It's like magnets trying to go together. It just doesn't work. So a financial advisor is totally disincentivized to do anything in that space. They likely don't have the knowledge or experience, know-how. So that's a huge issue. So again, from our perspective, we look at this and we say, well, we always talk about the many reasons why someone would consider going to the alternative space, right? We talk about potentially higher returns, unique strategies that I'm not finding inside my mutual fund options. And so if I want to have a more complete financial plan and build wealth in the most efficient way, then the traditional financial advisor is oftentimes working against you rather than for you to that end. Okay, Rod, let's talk about a couple of low-cost investment options that you would consider instead of going to your financial advisor. And we've been hitting on this as we talk through it, but just hit on these really quickly. And then we'll talk about some questions that you should probably ask your financial advisor.
Yeah, so probably the two that we'll talk about, number one is we already talked about Vanguard. And even inside of Vanguard, you can like go directly into an index fund. So like, for example, their S&P 500 equivalent ETF inside of Vanguard is a very low cost way to get into the same companies as you would get into if you were buying a mutual fund, but it's much less expensive. You're not, and maybe to clarify, on a mutual fund, you're basically buying into a company that's out there, has a lot of overhead because they're hiring staff. They have, they're trying to know where to get in and out of the different stocks at the right times based on a certain premise that they're built on for whatever risk profile. But long story short, they're getting in and out of the same 500 companies in a lot of cases as you would get if you just put your money into the S&P 500 and left it there. As an example, right? There are a lot of indexes out there, but that's obviously the biggest, the most popular.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there is a ton of proof that suggests that managed accounts have been more expensive and underperformed just using like a Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, right? And that's why that's the thing. People are getting a lot smarter these days, and so it's like they're starting to see like, oh, I'm missing out on huge amount of value by paying, I'm trying to Janus Funds. Is that the right name of it? It's been a while. So anyway, but it's just such a different expense ratio that exists in there that over time it has a massive impact on your investments. And again, the managed accounts, based on a lot of the data, suggest that it's underperforming. So you've got two things happening: paying more money and getting worse returns. Like, that's not how we want this to work,
Nope.
is it?
Nope. I hope not. Okay, so that's the first one. That's the low tech way. And then the higher tech way now is the robo advisors, or like these automated platforms, Robinhood and other places like that. You can plug into their platform yourself, right? Which again, we kept using that word for what the financial advisor is doing, is offering a platform. Well, great. Now you have a very similar type of platform. You just plug in, you can automate a lot of these things to be dumping money into that account, let the robo advisor do as good a job, if not better, than what you were expecting from that financial advisor, and
Pay
again,
a tenth of the price.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Makes a huge difference. So those are some of the alternatives that you could use. And we're talking about specifically on the investment side, right? Like, there are elements to planning outside of just investments that you've got to have conversations about, right? Obviously, we're life insurance guys. We have made it a big part of our specialization. And so that is a conversation that needs to be had too. We'll get into that here in just a second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So let's hit on some of the maybe things that you should be asking your financial advisor. And I'm just going to be like thinking about these as we go, because I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody sitting on that side of the table. Now, I guess technically I've sat on both sides of the table. I've been your traditional financial advisor. Obviously now I don't consider myself that. And so it kind of gives a little bit of a unique framework to figure this thing out. So here's the question. What are some things we should ask a financial advisor? I think the starting point is to understand how you're evaluating performance, right? Because that, if you don't start with that, then like, what are you getting out of it, right? Yeah. I think, and this sounds like a no-brainer, but I think most people don't do this. I would argue that most people they don't have any clue how they're determining whether they should keep working, continue to work with their advisor or not. Usually it's like, oh, well, hasn't been anything like bad, I guess. Like, that's usually the reason that someone says, right? Like, but nobody's saying, hey, we made an agreement that these things were going to happen in our relationship, and they've just really delivered on all of those things. Yeah. Now, if that's your financial advisor, you've got a really great one, and there's probably value that's being had there, right? But again, that is not what we see typically out there. So I would be asking them, what are we doing? Like, how are we evaluating whether this relationship makes sense for both sides of the table? That's the first thing that comes to my mind, Rod. What comes to yours?
Well, maybe just another thought on that is, so really, how does that work? Because what if you say, well, it's a certain return out there. They have to get me a certain return. Well, then the economy goes to pot, and all of a sudden nobody's getting any return. You're losing money. Oh, great. Do I have to fire him because he couldn't perform in a down environment? Well, that's a horrible way to approach it, right?
So you noticed, Rod, when I went through my evaluation, I specifically said, we talked, they said, here are expectations, and they delivered. I specifically did not say returns because, to your point, I think it's totally unreasonable, at least for a traditional financial advisor. It might be different if you're talking about evaluating your hedge fund manager. They're going to be evaluated on their expertise, which is to produce returns. A traditional financial advisor doesn't produce returns. That's not what they do. Their value has to be had in some other way. And I think that's a really important point.
And even if you want to translate it into return, well, establish a benchmark, okay? So you use the S&P in comparison with the other stuff where the managed funds underperform. So you say, okay, well, great. I can easily see what the S&P is doing. You need to beat that, right? If that's what you're trying to establish, and then you can go forward and know, right? You have a measurable as it relates to quote unquote. I think
that
return.
is important, right? Because you have to understand, like, if there's a drag on the return happening because of the fee, right? And then at that point, again, you would have to determine if there's value being had in other ways that makes up for the potential drag on the return that I would have gotten had I been in the 0.03% fee fund that is Vanguard versus, paying 1.5 or 2% at my brokerage account with Merrill Lynch.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I do have to make that assessment. And the question is, are there things that someone could do that would provide enough value outside of that to make sense of it? And again, I would say for most people, the answer is emphatically no. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to put the cart before the horse. I was going to say that doesn't mean that we don't need people who are experts in our life that we consult with and that bring value in those specific areas. We absolutely do. The question is more focused on like that traditional financial advisor. Now, again, I want to put a caveat here, and I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, but I'm a caveat in saying if I have a $200 million estate, obviously I'm most people aren't going to be in this situation, but let's say I have a $30 or $40 million estate and I have a lot going on. It probably does make sense to have somebody who's quarterbacking and helping me manage those things so that I'm not, just missing obvious opportunities or, or things that could potentially hurt me, right? There's value to organization. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's a different role than this. And that's what happens. The traditional financial advisor, they kind of get put into this pot where they're like, okay, is your job to keep me organized and make sure that we have these things in place, or is your job to produce great returns? Well, anyway, it's an interesting question,
point.
Right?
Yeah, it's a great point, because that's a measurement of performance, right? Are they providing that organization / planning element? I like it.
Okay. So some of the other things that you could, like you said, if you're looking at benchmark, I do think you have to look at benchmarks, right? So I don't want that point to get lost in, talking about how you evaluate them, because it's not like you can just say, hey, I can get 2% in my mutual fund portfolio while the benchmarks are getting 10 or 12, because I don't care what's happening outside of that. It's going to be hard to bring enough value to make up for, crushing an investment portfolio. So like there is an element that's important, but I do think, again, you just got to figure out what I'm going to be doing to evaluate whether the relationship is valuable for both sides. Okay. What other questions come to your mind? There's probably 100 questions you could ask, but like that's like the overarching thing on my mind.
Yeah. Well, you have to understand how they're being compensated.
Yes.
Because we talked earlier about the fee person versus the commission person. And there are a lot of people who are both, right? If they're doing planning for you and they're saying, okay, great, I'm going to charge you whatever, $5,000 for the plan. And I'm also going to invest your money over here and receive a percentage off of that. That's a thing as well. So you have to understand where all that's coming from, right?
Yeah,
and
that's a really great point.
And if you're only asking them for that kind of organization plan part of it, make sure that's all you're paying them for, right? Which is a fee, right?
By the way, I always tell people this, but anyone is welcome to ask us how we get paid, and we are more than happy to give a detailed account of that. Because as I said before, in the financial services world, there's just baked in conflicts of interest that don't have, at least up to this point that I've seen, any way that's like overcoming those things. As an example, life insurance is paid with commissions, right? Yep. And so there's really no other way to sell life insurance. It has to go through an agent. Those commissions just exist. What we do, obviously, is minimize those to produce the best return for people, but it still exists. And so there is, just because of that, a built-in conflict of interest. And so at that point, you've got to make sure that you're working with people that you have a relationship with, that have a good reputation, and that have expertise, build trust. Anyway, we'll get into that in just a second. So I think that one's really good, Rod. Any others that are coming to your mind?
I mean, this is a really difficult one in terms of understanding conflicts of interest. Part of it is that you just have to be savvy on that yourself. But it's worth asking, right? Like, again, this kind of goes back to my compensation question, but are you compensated for certain products and services, but not for others, right? And in some cases that may just be obvious, but it would be fair to ask a question like that and just make sure that you're all on the same page as far as how that works, so that you know what to expect from them moving forward. If you're looking at things that are outside of that, you can't expect them to be excited about you doing those things, number one. And then number two, any advice that they give on that's outside of that primary expertise of theirs is going to be biased because of where their expertise is, right? They may not know a whole lot about the other. And so it would be unrealistic to expect a good answer from them if you're saying, well, should I go invest in this piece of property or whatever, right?
Yeah, great point. Okay, Rod, I want to move on to our final kind of segment, which is going to be focused on what we typically recommend for people, right?
Yeah.
So basically what we've been doing is bashing on all of the bad things that traditional financial advisors do. And if you haven't gotten my point up to this point, I basically am saying for most of you out there, the traditional financial advisor is borderline useless, right? There are situations, but again, like, you know, those are kind of few and far between. We'll get into what I believe is a better model, one that will ultimately help you get to your financial goals much more effectively than if I, spend a lot of time working with my traditional advisor. Okay. And it's a really simple formula, Rod. The first one is education, right? Okay. So I've just got to go take some time, put some energy into becoming financially literate. Mm-hmm. If I'll do that, that's like 80% of the battle, right? Yeah. Just some basic financial literacy goes a long way. And my experience is that people who have basic financial literacy versus people who hire a financial advisor are generally better off because, well, there's a ton of reasons, but maybe none more important than like the self-assurance and knowing that they're making decisions that they actually feel good about, rather than just kind of hoping that they're trusting somebody who has their best interest at heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And when we meet up with a lot of people who have been on that traditional side and that's all they were doing, they made the money, they handed it off to someone and said, here, take care of this for me. I'll come back for it in 20 years when I'm ready to retire. Often when they got looking at it, it just wasn't acceptable to them what was happening because, number one, they didn't understand fee structure. It's the stuff we've been talking about. They didn't understand fee structure. They didn't understand the kind of return they were getting net of fees and taxes and other things like that. And
they didn't even know how to evaluate it.
Right. It just started to feel like, oh man, it doesn't feel like I'm really moving ahead. They're telling me I'm getting an average of whatever, but it doesn't really look like that. It's not feeling like it's actually happening. And that's often when people get motivated to become educated in the way you're talking. But maybe don't wait for that. If you're listening to this, don't wait for that moment to come in your future. If that's the way you're managing things now, be motivated now, right? Just take our word for it. Get educated on these things so you can understand and evaluate what you're doing. And if you keep down that path, great. Now you understand what you're doing, but please understand it.
Okay. I like it. There's lots of ways to become educated. We live in the information age. There's none better than the internet. Like, I don't even know what else to say. There's plenty of opportunities, blogs, books, videos, all sorts of expertise out there that we can get for free, really, or a totally reasonable price. But take the time and effort to do it, because just by doing it, it'll make you a difference. Okay, so that's the first part of the equation, education. Second part of the equation is DIY investing. Okay, do-it-yourself investing. A lot of reasons for this. One is because just by doing that, I give myself access to the whole alternative space, which I'm cutting off if I focus on and exclusively work with a traditional advisor. So if for no other reason than just that I'm getting access to half of the investment world that I didn't have before, that's enough of a reason to become educated and start focus on DIY investing. Now, I said this earlier, and I think this is important. Just because you're doing DIY investing doesn't mean that you have to be the one out there buying houses yourself, right? There's a lot of ways that you can invest, DIY invest, and still have it be passive or streamlined. And so the two are not like, if that's the reason that you're saying, well, I like the idea, but I just don't have, the time to go and, look at individual investments and that kind of thing. Well, it doesn't really take that much time. Like I would even argue that once you've gotten a baseline of education, the DIY investing is probably not any more time than you would take if you were just meeting occasionally with your traditional advisor, making decisions, and then they're going out and executing those few things. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Agree, right?
No, I agree on that. And I think the key on this is, like, I often use the analogy that you become your own quarterback, right? Instead of handing all your money to someone else and saying, here, go ahead, you're basically taking that decision-making role, and you're still passing the ball to different people, right? We're going to talk about that here in a minute. But the point is that you're putting yourself in that position where you're the one, or the analogy you used earlier, you're now the kind of the family physician role, referring to specialists, right?
Okay, so that, Rod, you're moving us nicely into the third leg of what makes up the kind of ideal world that we would say to go for, and that is specialists, education, DIY, and specialists. That will serve you so much better than the traditional advisor will, for a myriad of different reasons that we've hit on before. But when we talk about specialists, we're talking about like your CPA, your estate planning attorney. There's a dozen different types of, not that I'm saying you want to hire a dozen different types of attorneys, but my point is just to say, like, I'm not going to go to my advisor for probably much help on my will and trust, right? They're not going to be able to do much other than say, go get a will and trust. And so, like, basic financial literacy would suggest, I didn't need an advisor to tell me that I should go see a specialist to produce the will and trust. That just is kind of obvious to me at this point, right?
Yep.
So when I bring all of those things together, that really is what brings the best result. And that's kind of where we fit in as in our team. We're actually, I should say this, Rod, we're kind of a combination of both of these. And maybe I'll describe to people how that works. So obviously our specialization is in life insurance, and specifically we focus on helping you use life insurance as a wealth creation tool. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't know how to use it in the typical way where we're using it as a protection vehicle. Obviously, that's an important element, and we value that tremendously. But from a specialization standpoint, our focal point is, how do we use life insurance to create wealth, right? Yeah. So that's where our focus is. In addition to that, we just know general financial planning as well. So we end up playing in these various different spaces with the specialization there. But there's something that's unique about us, from like a little bit more unique from the traditional financial advisor. And that is that when I talk about the type of generalist we're more a generalist in the alternative space, right? So instead of helping people make moves towards stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, we'll help them make moves towards opportunities that exist in the alternative space. We'll educate on the value proposition, the risks, everything that goes along with that side. So it's kind of a similar role, except that, again, we aren't motivated by the investment side. We're not motivated by like the mutual fund investment side. We're motivated by helping people utilize life insurance as a wealth creation tool, then take that money and go invest it in alternative assets. And like I always give this caveat, Rod, because I feel like there's too many people who are too extreme. But my caveat is always that there's places where traditional investments absolutely make sense. And so that has to be a part of it. But again, our focus is a little bit different in that we want to help you find opportunities to invest and grow your wealth, specifically in the alternative space.
Whew. Yeah. And I'll bridge one other thing there, because we have a lot of people who work with us in that role. And because like you just said, they also have money in the traditional assets, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. and they have a traditional financial advisor, but they find out basically what we've been pointing out, that they can't provide them any value as it relates to how to use the different asset types in their world to make a plan, right?
Well,
Because
in
they don't have
fact,
the
it's
expertise
often
to do
doing
that.
more harm than good. Okay, I'll give you an
Right.
example. This is what we see. We see people come to us. Let's say that they worked with one of our partners, Anderson Business Advisors. They come through Anderson Business Advisors, and that person might have had, like, maybe they've been in that traditional space, right?
Mhm.
And so that's the way that, so now they're coming and they're like, but I really love what you're talking about. I really want to start investing in real estate and in other types of assets to diversify. So they're like, great. They make this move. They work with us. We set up the policy. We set up the, get them funding it so that they can then start using that money to go invest. And suddenly their traditional advisors like, wait, why isn't this money going into the investments that it was going in previously? And now they're like, oh, that whatever you're doing there is bad, right?
Mhm,
Like,
mhm.
this is a bad idea. But really what they're saying is, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not the space that I play in. And it's just very different. And so I guess I would just say, like, too often traditional advisors are having a negative impact, especially as it relates to, our mission, which is to help people become better at and better, more informed investors in the
Mhm.
alternative space, and understand the value proposition that exists there that, again, most people just don't realize they're missing out on.
Yeah. So what we've done is, because of this just disconnect, and people come frustrated and they're like, man, do you know anyone who can help me bridge this gap between still help me see what I'm doing on the traditional side and be useful and helpful integrating those things in my on the alternative side, so that I can have a cohesive plan moving forward. And again, like I said, a lot of our clients are doing that themselves. They're not asking for someone else, but there are just some people, they're like, you know what, I just need someone that can help me think this through and put this together. And so we have a member of our team that has that expertise. So if you find yourself in that situation and you'd like to have someone who understands the alternative space and the traditional space and this kind of quest of the person who's straddling and doing both, then we have someone that can help you out on that.
Okay, that's a good point. And I think it's a good way to finish off. I think the moral of the story is, don't use, no, I'm just kidding. That's not the moral. The moral of the story is, the situation is the boss. Why do we always end up with that, Rod?
Well, and I don't know whether I said the D word or not. Okay.
I don't remember.
I may have. If I apologize.
If you did, I missed it, and I should have caught it.
Okay.
But I think that's okay. Anyway, the situation is the boss. The reality is that most often, though, and I just want to emphasize this because this is just how I feel about it. Most often, a traditional financial advisor is borderline useless. So take that for what it's worth. Take it to the bank. Take it to the dump. One way or another, that's my take on it. Okay, this has been a fun conversation. Thanks everybody for listening, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth-building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.